The nonprofit director smiled warmly as she welcomed another family into the resettlement center. The mother, father, and 3 children had arrived from a refugee camp after 18 months of processing. They carried documents provided by Safe Harbor Foundation, a nonprofit organization that specialized in refugee assistance and resettlement services. The family believed they were beginning a new life in America with the support of a humanitarian organization. They had no way of knowing that within 72 hours they would be separated, their documents would be confiscated, and they would become property in a human trafficking network that had been operating under humanitarian cover for 6 years. Safe Harbor Foundation had built an impeccable reputation in the refugee assistance community. The organization operated resettlement centers in 8 states, provided legal services to asylum seekers, coordinated with international refugee agencies, and maintained partnerships with faith-based organizations across the country. Their annual reports documented thousands of successful resettlements. Their fundraising materials featured emotional testimonials from families they had helped. Major donors included prominent philanthropists and corporate foundations. The organization's founder had been profiled in national media as an example of effective humanitarian leadership. Every external indicator suggested Safe Harbor was exactly what it claimed to be: a lifeline for the world's most vulnerable people. The organizational structure appeared designed for maximum impact and efficiency. Safe Harbor maintained relationships with refugee camps and processing centers in 12 countries. They expedited paperwork, provided advance housing arrangements, and coordinated arrival logistics. Refugees selected for Safe Harbor assistance received priority processing and enhanced support services. The organization's reputation within international refugee systems was strong enough that camp administrators actively referred families to their programs. Safe Harbor had positioned itself as the gold standard in refugee resettlement, an organization that combined compassion with operational excellence. But Safe Harbor Foundation was not a humanitarian organization. It was a sophisticated human trafficking operation that had infiltrated refugee assistance networks to gain access to vulnerable populations. The resettlement centers were sorting facilities. The legal services were methods for controlling victims. The international partnerships were recruitment pipelines. And the successful resettlement stories were carefully constructed fictions that concealed a criminal enterprise generating more than $150 million annually through forced labor and exploitation. The operation had started 12 years earlier when the founder recognized an opportunity in the chaos of global refugee crises. Displaced populations, desperate for safety and legitimate status, would trust organizations that promised assistance. Once under Safe Harbor's control, refugees could be exploited without effective recourse because their vulnerable legal status, language barriers, and isolation from established communities made them unlikely to seek help or be believed if they did. The founder had built Safe Harbor specifically to access victims who could be trafficked with minimal risk of detection or prosecution. The system operated through careful compartmentalization. Most Safe Harbor employees were genuine humanitarian workers who believed in the organization's mission. They processed applications, coordinated logistics, and provided real assistance to some refugees. This legitimate activity created cover for the trafficking operation while ensuring that external audits and inspections would find properly documented programs serving real people. The trafficking component operated through a parallel structure. Certain families were flagged during the selection process using criteria designed to identify those most vulnerable and isolated. Single parents, families with no existing connections in the United States, individuals with skills valuable in labor markets, and women who fit specific physical profiles were marked for diversion from legitimate resettlement into trafficking. The diversion occurred during the arrival and processing phase. Families marked for trafficking would be met by safe harbor staff who would separate them under various pretexts. Children would be taken to special orientation programs. Men would be sent to employment training centers. Women would be directed to housing facilities. The separations were presented as standard procedures designed to streamline the resettlement process. By the time families realized something was wrong, they were already physically separated, their documents had been confiscated, and they were under the control of traffickers who spoke their languages and understood their vulnerabilities. The trafficking network operated across multiple sectors. Men were forced into agricultural labor, construction work, and service industry positions where their illegal or tenuous immigration status prevented them from reporting wage theft or dangerous conditions. Women were exploited in domestic servitude, massage parlors, and other commercial sex operations. Children were placed in what appeared to be foster care or educational programs, but were actually systems for long-term exploitation. The diversity of the trafficking operations made the pattern harder to detect because victims were dispersed across different industries and geographic locations, rather than concentrated in ways that might attract law enforcement attention. Safe Harbor maintained control through a combination of physical isolation, document control, debt bondage, and threats. Victims were told they had entered the country illegally through Safe Harbor's assistance and would be deported if they contacted authorities. They were charged inflated fees for housing, food, and legal services, creating debts that could never be repaid through the wages they were allowed to keep. Family members were used as leverage against each other, and the language barriers combined with deliberate misinformation about American legal systems convinced victims they had no viable options for escape or assistance. The scale of the operation had grown steadily over 6 years. Safe Harbor had trafficked more than 8,000 individuals during that period, generating revenue that funded the organization's continued expansion and the personal enrichment of those running the trafficking operation. The financial sophistication rivaled the operational complexity. Trafficking proceeds were laundered through the nonprofits, legitimate programs, property investments, and international transfers that exploited the same refugee assistance networks used to transport victims. Tax filings showed a growing humanitarian organization serving increasing numbers of refugees. The reality was a criminal enterprise that had industrialized human trafficking by embedding it within trusted humanitarian systems. The first break in the case came from an unexpected source. A victim who had been trafficked through Safe Harbor 5 years earlier had managed to escape and rebuild her life. She contacted a refugee advocacy organization, not initially to report trafficking, but to seek help locating her daughter, who had been separated from her during what she believed was a legitimate resettlement process. The advocate who took her call recognized elements in her story that suggested something beyond a bureaucratic mistake. Within days, the advocate had contacted the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force with information that would launch an investigation into Safe Harbor Foundation. Federal investigators approached the case with careful attention to the victim's safety and the likelihood that there were many more victims still under Safe Harbor's control. Premature action could endanger those victims or cause the trafficking network to shut down and relocate before law enforcement could document the full scope. The investigation proceeded methodically. Agents identified other individuals who had been trafficked through Safe Harbor by cross-referencing the organization's public resettlement data with reports of labor exploitation, missing persons cases, and welfare checks on refugee families that had lost contact with extended family members. The pattern that emerged was consistent and disturbing. Families assisted by Safe Harbor frequently experienced unexplained separations during the resettlement process. Follow-up attempts by international relatives or humanitarian organizations to contact these families often failed. And investigation into the employment and housing situations of refugees who had gone through Safe Harbor programs revealed conditions that met legal definitions of forced labor and human trafficking. The FBI began building a comprehensive case that would require years of investigation to document fully. But the human cost of allowing the operation to continue demanded more immediate action. The breakthrough came from financial analysis. Safe Harbor Foundation's tax filings and donor reports showed steady growth in both fundraising and program expenses. But forensic accountants examining the organization's financial flows identified discrepancies that suggested systematic fraud alongside the trafficking operations. Donations were being diverted to personal accounts controlled by senior leadership. Properties purchased for resettlement housing were being used for trafficking operations, and vendor contracts for services were actually payments to criminal associates who operated the various labor and sex trafficking enterprises where victims were exploited. The financial evidence provided grounds for search warrants and asset seizures that would support the law enforcement operation against Safe Harbor. The investigation also revealed connections between Safe Harbor and international criminal networks. The founder had relationships with traffickers in source countries who identified vulnerable refugees before they even entered Safe Harbor's assistance programs. These overseas partners would provide information about families with valuable labor skills, women suitable for commercial sexual exploitation, and individuals whose isolation and desperation made them unlikely to resist or report their situations. The international dimension meant Safe Harbor was not just trafficking refugees who happened to seek their assistance, but was actively selecting victims through coordinated networks spanning multiple countries. The FBI faced a tactical challenge unlike typical human trafficking investigations. Safe Harbor had more than 8,000 victims dispersed across 8 states and multiple industries. Many victims had been in trafficking situations for years. Some had been conditioned to distrust law enforcement or believe they were complicit in their own illegal entry and would face prosecution if discovered. The FBI would need to execute a coordinated operation that simultaneously shut down Safe Harbor's operations, secured locations where victims were being held, and provided immediate services to thousands of traumatized individuals who would need medical care, legal assistance, translation services, and long-term support. The operation required unprecedented coordination between federal, state, and local law enforcement, immigration authorities, social services agencies, nonprofit victim assistance organizations, and international partners. Planning consumed 4 months. The FBI mapped every Safe Harbor facility, identified locations where victims were being held or exploited, and prepared to deploy more than 800 agents and support personnel. Meanwhile, victim services organizations prepared to receive potentially thousands of individuals who would need immediate assistance. The complexity was staggering, but the alternative was allowing the trafficking to continue. On March 23rd at 5 a.m. local time across 8 states, FBI tactical teams executed simultaneous raids on Safe Harbor Foundation facilities, trafficking locations, and residences of individuals connected to the operation. The coordination was precise. Resettlement centers, agricultural operations where men were being held in forced labor, massage parlors and other commercial sex locations, and private residences where women were held in domestic servitude were all secured within the first hour. Safe Harbor's headquarters was seized along with financial records, computer systems, and evidence documenting 6 years of systematic human trafficking hidden within humanitarian operations. The immediate aftermath was chaos carefully managed by the extensive planning. Victims were transported to secure locations where they received medical screening, trauma-informed interviews, and access to legal services. Many victims were initially fearful or confused about what was happening. Some believed they were being arrested. Others had been so thoroughly controlled and manipulated that they defended Safe Harbor and claimed there had been a mistake. The FBI had prepared for these reactions by ensuring that victim services specialists, interpreters, and cultural liaisons were present from the first moments of contact. The arrests totaled 63 individuals, including Safe Harbor's founder, senior leadership, employees who had knowingly participated in the trafficking operation, and associates who operated the various enterprises where victims were exploited. The charges included human trafficking, forced labor, sex trafficking of minors, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The evidence was extensive and included testimony from victims, financial records showing the flow of trafficking proceeds, and communications documenting the selection and diversion of refugees into trafficking. The number of identified victims was staggering. The initial operation recovered 2,300 individuals from active trafficking situations. Over the following 6 months, as the FBI continued investigating and victims came forward after learning about the operation through media coverage and community outreach, the total exceeded 8,000 individuals who had been trafficked through Safe Harbor over 6 years. Each victim had a story of trust betrayed, suffering endured, and a future stolen. The collective trauma represented one of the largest human trafficking cases in American history. The trial revealed the full depravity of the operation. The founder had built Safe Harbor specifically to exploit refugees, viewing them as an ideal victim population because their vulnerability and isolation made them easy to control. Email communications introduced as evidence showed the founder discussing refugees in purely transactional terms, calculating the economic value of different types of victims and the optimal exploitation strategies for maximizing profits. One particularly damning email stated, "Refugee families are self-replenishing inventory with minimal acquisition costs and extremely low risk of law enforcement intervention." The prosecution used that quote repeatedly to demonstrate the calculated cruelty of the operation. The psychological manipulation used to control victims was systematic and brutal. Victims were told their asylum claims had been fraudulent and that Safe Harbor had created their legal status through illegal means. They were convinced that reporting their situations would result in their deportation and permanent separation from family members who remained overseas. Some were told that their children were being held in different locations and would be harmed if they attempted escape or contact with authorities. The traffickers exploited every vulnerability, every fear, and every hope that victims carried. The sentences reflected the severity of the crimes. The founder received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Other senior leaders received sentences ranging from 30 to 50 years. Lower-level participants who had operated specific trafficking locations or provided support services received 10 to 25 years. The message was unequivocal. Using humanitarian cover to traffic vulnerable people represented a fundamental betrayal of human decency that would be punished with maximum severity. The victim recovery and support process extended for years after the initial operation. Many victims required extensive medical care for injuries and illnesses that had gone untreated during their trafficking. Psychological trauma counseling became a long-term need for individuals who had experienced prolonged exploitation. Legal services helped victims navigate immigration status, family reunification, and in some cases criminal proceedings against their traffickers. The federal government allocated over $200 million in victim services funding, but advocates noted that amount could never fully address the harm caused by 6 years of systematic trafficking. Family reunifications were complex and emotional. Children who had been separated from parents during the diversion into trafficking were sometimes located in different states years later. Some had been placed in legitimate foster care systems after being abandoned by traffickers, with no records of their true identities or families. Others had been held in trafficking situations themselves. The FBI worked with international agencies to reconnect families that had been separated across borders. The success stories of reunited families were genuine moments of hope in an otherwise dark case, but many families would never be fully reunited because some victims had died during their trafficking or had been moved to unknown locations. The investigation also exposed failures in the refugee assistance and oversight systems that had allowed Safe Harbor to operate for 6 years without detection. The organization had undergone audits, inspections, and reviews by multiple agencies and had passed them all. The fraud and trafficking had been hidden behind legitimate programs that served enough real refugees to maintain the facade. The compartmentalization meant that most employees genuinely believed they were working for a humanitarian organization. And the victims' vulnerability made them unlikely to report abuse in ways that would trigger official investigations. The combination of factors created a perfect camouflage that only unraveled when a single victim found the courage to seek help. The refugee resettlement community underwent significant changes in response to the Safe Harbor case. Background checks for nonprofit leaders were enhanced. Financial audits were expanded to look for patterns consistent with trafficking. Victim identification training became mandatory for staff working in resettlement programs. And, crucially, direct engagement with refugees about their rights and available resources increased, creating more opportunities for victims to identify themselves and seek help. The changes were implemented across the United States and influenced international refugee assistance protocols. The Safe Harbor case also highlighted the intersection of immigration policy and human trafficking vulnerability. Refugees and asylum seekers are among the most vulnerable populations for trafficking because of their lack of established social networks, limited knowledge of local systems, language barriers, and immigration status concerns. Traffickers exploit these vulnerabilities systematically. The FBI operation demonstrated that effective trafficking prevention required not just law enforcement, but also comprehensive support systems that helped refugees integrate safely into communities with knowledge of their rights and access to assistance. The properties and assets seized from Safe Harbor and the convicted traffickers were liquidated to fund victim compensation and support services. The nonprofit's extensive real estate holdings, financial accounts, and other assets were valued at over $130 million. The liquidation process took years, but ultimately provided resources that helped victims rebuild their lives. Some victims received direct financial compensation. Others received support through expanded victim services programs. The use of seized assets to help those who had been harmed represented a form of restorative justice that complemented the criminal sentences imposed on the traffickers. The international cooperation required to investigate and prosecute the Safe Harbor case created lasting relationships between law enforcement agencies, humanitarian organizations, and refugee assistance networks across multiple countries. The FBI shared intelligence on trafficking methods, victim identification techniques, and financial tracking strategies. Some source countries improved their refugee screening processes to identify families at risk of trafficking. And international humanitarian organizations implemented new protocols for verifying the legitimacy of resettlement partners. The collaboration helped prevent similar operations from developing in other contexts. For the first victim who had escaped and contacted the advocate years after her trafficking, the FBI operation represented vindication and the beginning of healing. She had spent 5 years convinced that her daughter was lost forever, that no one would believe her story, and that the organization that had trafficked her was untouchable. The FBI's action proved that justice was possible even against well-connected operations hiding behind humanitarian reputations. She was reunited with her daughter during the recovery operations, and both received comprehensive services to address their trauma. Her courage in coming forward had likely saved thousands of others from continued exploitation. Today, the organizations that replaced safe harbor in providing legitimate refugee assistance operate with heightened awareness of trafficking risks and enhanced safeguards to protect vulnerable populations. The refugee resettlement process includes more touchpoints where victims can identify themselves safely. And the humanitarian community maintains vigilance about organizations that seem too good to be true or operate with insufficient transparency. The FBI prevented what could have been years of additional trafficking by acting decisively once the operation was documented. But the case served as a reminder that traffickers will exploit any system that provides access to vulnerable people.